Mobile gaming has changed, and I don't think it's changing for the better. I actually think it's starting to change for the worse. I wouldn't just be saying this out of nowhere because my entire YouTube channel surrounds mobile games. I have built it up since December 2013, focused on mobile gaming, man, all right? I love this platform, and I don't want it to start to head in the wrong direction. I started playing games like Pixel Gun 3D, Minecraft Pocket Edition, Angry Birds, Cut the Rope, back when it was in a very primitive state, right? And then I watched it evolve to a few years later when the Gameloft games started to come out, the Modern Combat series, the Gangstar series. I'm sure you remember those ones, right? To a few years later when you started to get the Battle Royale titles like Fortnite Mobile, PUBG Mobile, and then eventually Call of Duty Mobile with their special Battle Royale mode. To then finally in present day when you have these big AAA titles like Arena Breakout, Valorant Mobile, Warzone Mobile, Apex Mobile before that game got shut down, and so many other cool games coming out. So how is it that right now we have some of the coolest games coming out, but at the same time, we also are starting to head in the wrong direction? Well, I think there's a lot of reasons because of this, and I want to explain myself to start. I think a lot of developers are not really thinking long-term as much anymore with a lot of these games. Back in 2013, 2014, even up to 2016 before the Battle Royale era, game developers would release games and they would expect their games to last 5+ years a lot of the time. That's why you have games like Pixel Gun 3D still around nowadays. For over 10 years that game has been out. Minecraft Pocket Edition, the Modern Combat series still has games that are playable to this day 10 years after release. Nowadays you hear about titles that come out in 2021 and then they're shut down by 2022 or 2020 and then they're now shutting down just a few years later, right? You don't really have the same type of longevity that you had with titles back then. And also, I think another reason because of this is because you have these massive corporations funding so many of the titles nowadays. Mobile gaming was very primitive back in the early 2010s, and you didn't have these massive companies like NetEase and Tencent, EA, Ubisoft, Activision dipping their foot completely in the water yet, right? You had a lot more games made by these indie developers that poured their heart and soul into the game, right? They didn't want their game to die. They spent all of their money trying to develop these games, and they wanted them to last. They listened to community feedback, and they just wanted their game to thrive. And that's why you had some of these amazing titles that came out pre-2015, right? Nowadays, so many more games are being funded by these billion-dollar companies where the second they start to lose a player count, it's kind of okay, all right, let's move on to the next game. And not every company is like that. There are some games that actually have a very, very good development team, like Call of Duty Mobile, for instance, right? Where that game's been around for 5-6 years at this point in time, still going strong. Basically, there are a lot more games that are not doing well than games that are doing well that have come out after 2017, 2018, something like that. And I think it's kind of the issue with this whole monopoly type of idea that gaming is starting to head. PC has done this a few years before mobile gaming, and you started to see fewer and fewer companies backing these big games. You would see a new game come out, and chances are it was probably an Activision game or a Ubisoft game or an EA game, and there were less and less indie games out there. Luckily, nowadays, over the past year or so, it's starting to change. So many bad AAA games have come out on PC and console where you're actually starting to see a resurgence in these indie games, right? I remember that one game that came out, that one little camera game, where you would take a picture and then teleport through it. Crazy stuff like that, so many other games. I don't really know too much about the PC games, but I always hear people talking about them on my Twitter feed, and it seems like a lot more indie games are starting to become more popular. Mobile gaming is not there yet. Mobile gaming is not there yet. It's going to take a few more years, I think, but if mobile gaming starts to head in that right direction, you're going to start to see more indie games coming out. But as of right now, it's not. It's not heading in that right direction, right? And fewer companies are releasing these games. It's kind of like if we could take a history lesson back in time. Let's take a look at the oil boom from 150 years ago. When oil was first discovered, you started to have all of these companies start to make their own oil. They would drill for it in Texas and Oklahoma, and it would be hundreds of different companies everywhere. These little family companies that would put a few different oil wells on their property, and they all competed with one another. It was great. But then these bigger companies started to buy them up, and then it was fewer and fewer and fewer. And then you had, I think it was called Standard Oil, right? And then that was basically it. You were like in a monopoly, and then what you got was that. If you were unhappy with it, that's kind of too bad. That's the only option that you had. Same thing with like railroads, for instance. Railroads, there were so many different railroad companies. They started to get bought out, and then you only have like your few government railroad companies, and that's about it. Same thing with cars. Same thing with computers. So many different computer companies out there. And then the same thing with consoles. Back in like the 80s and 90s, you used to have so many different companies developing gaming consoles, very primitive consoles, but then it became fewer and fewer, and you started to only have like your Xbox, PlayStation, Nintendo. That's about it, right? There's not many other big console name brands nowadays in the 2020s. That's the same thing with PC gaming. That's the same thing with mobile gaming. So what I really think mobile gaming developers should kind of stress is the longevity of their games. And just because you're getting the funding by a massive company, you really need to like get that in writing that you want your game to last for many more years. Because if you're thinking more long term, then it doesn't matter if there's few companies developing them. They are going to put in the effort to make these games last and do well for many, many years to come. I don't freaking care if it's sponsored by Tencent, or anything like that. Tencent knows how to make good games. They just, for whatever reason, don't end up having them last a super long time. The same thing with NetEase, the same thing with Ubisoft, Activision, all of these companies, they just don't have them last as long as some of these indie games that have come out in the past. And there's another issue that I notice with a lot of mobile games nowadays. You start to see more and more games come out in beta or alpha even, and then they sit there for such a long time. People can play these games, and then they end up like losing hype. I don't know how to describe it, but like a game comes out, say in May of 2024 in an alpha. They start to have alpha tests in like a couple of different countries, Brazil, Indonesia, right? They do it for a few months. Then it goes quiet. Then it does another alpha test, and then it goes quiet. Then finally they do some beta test for more people, and then you can actually download the game from their Twitter page or some type of obscure way. Many more people play the game, the people that were actually excited about it. Then they finally have a soft launch, and then they finally have global launch like a year, 2 years later. At this point in time, all of the content creators on YouTube have already been making videos on the game. They've already showed it to their audience. The audience already knows what to expect with the game, and the game probably has lost a lot of hype. People have already seen so many videos on it, they feel like they've already played the game at this point in time. It's different from like games that came out in 2013, 2014, where social media was a lot newer. People weren't constantly following the latest updates on which games were coming out, and then kind of out of nowhere, they would just see a game on the App Store appear on their homepage, and then they download it, they look it up on YouTube, and then, oh my God, the game just came out. Whoa, okay, let me go look up some videos. And then these games had much bigger launches. And even better, games would just kind of release quietly. They would take the time to like fix bugs in a full public version, right? With very few people online. And then eventually, once people started playing the game more, there were more and more in-app purchases purchased by people. They started to get some more revenue. They could pay for more ads. And then eventually more and more people would find out about it. I miss the days when like this hidden game is found by some YouTuber, and then everybody starts playing it. You don't have that anymore. All the leakers are very prominent on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. They tell us about all of these games before they even come out. So we know what to expect when the game does come out. For instance, Overwatch Mobile, if that game ever comes out, we know what to expect. Valorant Mobile, we know what to expect when that game comes out. We've seen so many gameplays for years at this point in time. There's no surprises when that game releases. Destiny Mobile's another one that we kind of know what to expect based off of the leaks that we've seen so far. And I could go on and on, right? There's not really many games anymore that are just kind of found out of the blue, and then they get this massive level of support almost overnight. It's a lot more concrete, a lot more standard, and you kind of just have to follow this more generic path of doing alpha, beta tests, starting to get in contact with content creators, making them make videos, and then finally doing a global launch. And that's why you don't see as many games releasing with as big of a public appeal as you did with like Call of Duty Mobile and then PUBG Mobile back, 4 or 5 years ago. I remember when Rules of Survival came out, that game was massive for a little while, right? And that game didn't even have a very long lifespan, but that game exploded in popularity. Everybody was so hyped about it, right? But I really don't remember watching videos from people before that game came out. You know, now that I look back on YouTube, I can find videos from like a beta version of Rules of Survival, but it wasn't nearly as prominent as like the beta versions that we have now. These games were a lot more hidden back then, and then they just released. Everybody could play it all at the same time, and then the game just exploded in popularity. So I think what a lot of developers probably should try to do more so of is try to have more people play them all at the same time when the game first comes out. It's okay if a game has bugs and glitches. You don't have to make it completely perfect. If you try to perfect every little detail and have so many people test the game and give their feedback constantly for years and years on end, you're going to eventually lose popularity from those core players that you first had. And then when you finally do release it, you're just not going to have that same level of support like you would if you just released it not 100% perfect. You could have fixed the glitches and bugs a few days after global release, but, you know, overall it was still a playable game. I get where these game developers are coming from. It would be really stupid to just spend all of your money developing a game and then releasing it without doing the proper testing, without having content creators promoting the game beforehand and stuff like that. But that's the biggest issue in my opinion. You spend so much money developing these games that you kind of have to follow the same standard formula every single time you release them. And eventually it starts to get stale. What I really liked about games back like pre-2015, even some of the games nowadays, there's some games out there that still follow the same formula, is the developers don't spend a ton of money developing the game, right? There are these indie games where they spend a little bit of money just getting it up to a working version. And because they didn't spend that much money, they didn't sink their entire life savings into the development of the game, they could play around a little bit more, explore with new features, and just do things more creatively, as opposed to just following this same standard formula that so many games are doing nowadays. There were some of those game developers back in like 2014 that did sink their money entirely into their game. Some of them failed, and that's unfortunate. But some of them really did succeed, and that's where that longevity came in. They spent so much money, they poured their heart and soul into that game that they're going to make that game freaking last if that's the last thing that they do. You could have Tencent, Activision, NetEase put in like $50 million into a game. And if it fails like a couple of months after release, it's kind of like, okay, whatever. Doesn't really matter. We had the money set aside anyways, so it's not really a big loss for us. We're just going to develop something else, right? And there's less of a risk for these companies. So they kind of just put out a game. They spend all the money on the advertisement. They try to get as much money as possible on the game. They have a very standard formula to appease the most amount of people, least amount of creativity with a lot of these games. And then if it fails, oh well, we'll just do another one that's kind of similar to the last one. Repeat the process over and over and over again. You guys get the idea. Now, I'm not going to say there aren't fantastic games made by these companies. I could go through each company and say a fantastic game that like gets a 10 out of 10 in my book, you know? Arena Breakout by Tencent. Once Human by NetEase, Call of Duty Mobile by Activision, Rainbow Six Mobile by Ubisoft, and then Apex Legends Mobile when it was still around by EA. All of these were fantastic games. So I don't want these developers to get all mad and disgruntled and be like, oh, no, we do make good games. Because yes, I do understand that. It's just a lot of the games that are coming out nowadays are not really focused too much long term. They're focused much more on the short term, capitalize on the hype that the game has. But at the same time, you're kind of failing at that because you've had so many alpha and beta tests and soft launches for such a long time that you end up losing hype. So you have a game that's already lost hype before global launch, and then you have a game that doesn't even last very long after global launch. How is that a good formula for success? I don't really know. That's the issue that PC gaming and console gaming had for a little while, and then they finally started to head in the right direction. More and more of these indie games have started to come out, but mobile gaming really hasn't started to head in that right direction yet. It's still going down that path of fewer and fewer mega companies backing these games. They don't have that long of a lifespan. They have so much money to just blow on these games, so there's less of a risk. They don't really care if the games fail, and then they just lose all the hype before global launch because they just have this never-ending period of beta, alpha tests, soft launches, and stuff like that. A lot less indie games are coming out, and that needs to change. So what I would welcome everybody who is interested in making mobile games do is try to make a cool game. Don't spend a ton of money on it, all right? Don't sink your life savings into it. Just make something fun, unique, creative, and let the YouTubers know about it. Me and so many other YouTubers would be desperate to play really freaking cool games that are different from the AAA titles that we all are playing right now. A lot of us have made a lot less content recently. You can see that from my channel, you can see that from so many other people's channels, and we also are all kind of collectively declining. All right, I don't think there's a single big YouTuber that is going up a lot in views right now, at least in the whole mobile gaming shooting genre. You can feel free to let me know in the comments, but like no massive YouTuber with like, you know, 200,000 plus subscribers is doing really well right now. And it's because all of these games, like I said, are losing hype. There's not that much interest in this whole genre as a whole right now, and there just needs to be more creative, more indie games nowadays. So even if the big companies want to sponsor some of these smaller indie teams, I welcome them to do this. We got to have more of these Among Us, you know, Fall Guys types of games coming out for mobile. Original ones, not just based off of a PC game, but you got to have games like that. And I don't care if they're sponsored by Tencent or Activision or EA or whatever. It doesn't matter, right? As long as they have that long-term mindset, then that's a good thing. And I think a lot more of these games would do really well, especially on like YouTube and stuff like that, if they were more creative with this whole mindset in mind. But yeah, that's a lot to take in. I am criticizing a lot of these big companies a little bit. I don't want them to dislike me, but I am going to criticize them because I don't think a lot of them have that long-term mindset in mind anymore. They need to think of all of their games as a bigger risk whenever they release any of them. They need to like put a lot more on the line with each and every game. Make every single game a complete banger and nothing less, and have all of these games last for a really long time. What I really think they need to realize is you don't need to release games constantly if you already have very successful games. If you have a game that has a long-term development plan, then you can put a lot more effort into releasing updates for that game as opposed to just immediately going to develop the next one that you're going to release the next year. I don't know. I think that makes sense in my personal opinion, but I am rambling. I really hope a lot of these mega companies start to follow this direction because we're finally starting to see that on PC. Hopefully mobile gaming is going to follow suit, but yeah, in the meantime, I'm going to try to find some indie games, some more creative games to show to you all on YouTube, and I hope other YouTubers do the same. It's our job as YouTubers to promote these games that are not made by mega companies, so we actually give other developers incentives to want to create these games, release them for us. Otherwise, we're just going to be stuck with the same generic games that you probably play right now. I don't know. That's basically it. But I hope you guys agreed with what I had to say. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please take a second and leave a like and subscribe for more mobile gaming content like this. And I'll see you guys in the next episode.